welcome to Daily Debrief, your primer on all the top international stories from around the world, brought to you by People's Dispatch. I'm Siddhant Ani, and with me, as always, is Prashant.
Hi.
How are you doing?
Good.
Not much to celebrate today, actually. It's a pretty serious show, and we're starting with the Pandora Papers, which we briefly mentioned in yesterday's show. Hundreds of world leaders, powerful politicians, billionaires, celebrities, religious leaders, and drug dealers have been hiding their investments in mansions, exclusive beachfront property, yachts, and other assets for the past quarter century, says a review of nearly 12 million files obtained from 14 firms located around the world. The report, released on Sunday by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, ICIJ, involved 600 journalists from 150 media outlets in 117 countries. It's being dubbed Pandora Papers because the findings shed light on previously hidden dealings of the elite and the corrupt, and how, of course, they've used offshore accounts to shield assets collectively worth trillions of dollars. The more than 330 current and former politicians identified as beneficiaries of these offshore accounts include Jordan's King Abdullah II, former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair, Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta, Ecuador's President Guillermo Lasso, and associates of both Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan and Russian President Vladimir Putin. Let's first listen in to senior journalist Paranjoy Guha Thakurta, who gave us pretty much a primer on what the papers involved.
April 2016 came the Panama Papers. Then came the Paradise Papers, and now the latest expose by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, based on leaks, is the Pandora Papers set of documents, the biggest ever leak of its kind. And the partner of the ICIJ in India is the Indian Express, and they've come up with a list of some of the big, well-known names, lots of big names, sportspersons, filmspersons, people from Bollywood, and of course, well-known industrialists. Among the people whose pictures are shown right on the front page, and all this came out very early in the morning on Monday. Now, what do all these names have in common? They've kept their money in tax havens. What are tax havens? They are jurisdictions where entities registered, corporate entities registered in these jurisdictions, pay no tax or very little. And this has been the favorite way in which the rich and the powerful across the globe keep their money. And in these jurisdictions, and there are over 80 of them across the world, there is a very, very thin dividing line between legal forms of tax avoidance, what accountants call good tax planning, and illegal forms of evasion and money laundering. Now, there's more to come. That's what the ICIJ and the Indian Express has promised. And it's not just India. We have very, very big names, heads of government, heads of state, the King of Jordan, King Abdullah. Then we also have the presidents of Ukraine, Kenya, Ecuador. We have the Prime Minister of the Czech Republic. We have the former Prime Minister of Britain, Tony Blair. We have associates of the Prime Minister of Pakistan, Imran Khan. And yes, more names are coming. What's the story in brief? The wealthy and the influential, they are able to pay little or no taxes in their home jurisdictions. And what does this result in? A widening divide, a widening gap between the rich and the poor. This is the sum and the substance of the Pandora Papers, and there's more to come.
Prashant, complex, lots and lots and lots of data, terabytes of data.
Right.
What do common people like you and I figure from all of this?
Good question, Siddhant, because like you said, this is, of course, the amount of data is huge. The kind of information it talks about, tax havens, banking, accounting, a lot of this is actually very difficult to understand for people like us in general. But I think the underlying message is very clear that there exists a massive infrastructure across the world which enables people who are rich to sort of stash their wealth elsewhere
Hmm.
to avoid the kind of taxes that ordinary people like us have to pay. Now, a very good example, if you look at in 2019 numbers, the estimate was that nearly $36 trillion was actually, say, put in such illegal tax havens. So just imagine that number, 36 trillion. Okay. Now, on the other hand, if you want
Cannot.
to, exact, good point, you cannot. Now, if you want to remove hunger in the world,
Hmm.
the amount that we need to spend is somewhere per annum across the world is somewhere in 200 to 300 billion dollars, right? So that's the amount that you need to completely remove hunger, eradicate hunger. The same for ensuring education for all. So this is basically a huge amount of wealth that we're talking about here. Now the point is, see, a lot of this may not even be illegal. That's what I think the defense for many of these leaders has been, that this is not illegal per se. It's part of the tax law, right? Now, the real question is that don't these laws have to be amended, for instance, to ensure that there are no loopholes like this? No loopholes which enable you, for instance, to say that I will not directly buy property. What I'll do is I'll buy shares in a company which owns a certain property, right? And basically what happens is that company is located in one of these tax havens like the British Virgin Islands or the Cayman Islands or whatever, and therefore you escape a huge amount of tax. So basically what you do as a powerful person, as a person with wealth, is that you move your wealth outside the country, often sometimes inside the country, and all is good because you save probably hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions in terms of tax as well. So that's the process involved here. And really the question is that shouldn't these loopholes be closed? And we see that it's not only, of course, you mentioned the politicians, but we also, like you said, have business leaders.
Yeah.
We also have socialites. We also have religious leaders, an entire spectrum of who's who, sports persons, who are wealthy people, all of whom indulge in this almost as in a taken for granted kind of way.
Yeah.
It's not even that.
It's sort of the way of being. Like if
Exactly.
you have so much money, then you have
The
to.
next step is
yeah.
basically to sort of how do you avoid paying
Stash
as much
it somewhere.
taxes. And this really means that it's the countries which don't get this money, right? Because this is tax money that you are supposed to get that you are not getting, and therefore that you're not able to spend. Now, the other important dimension, I think, is that a lot of the leaders you're talking about here actually came to power based on very strong anti-corruption
Right.
messages. So this is really a question for them. You mentioned Vladimir Zelensky of Ukraine, for that matter, Uhuru Kenyatta of Kenya, a lot of others, for instance, who came to power saying that they would take very strong anti-corruption stances. And now it is revealed that many of them or their family members or their close friends actually use this route in order to park money outside or, say, buy properties or yachts or luxury goods. Of course, there are people like King Abdullah of Jordan, for whom there is an entire empire outside of real estate. Now he's saying it's his private money. But really the question is that this is a huge question mark on a lot of leaders who claimed that we are, part of this anti-corruption crusade. And it actually, to some extent, demonstrates the flaw in many of these anti-corruption messages. You have a leader coming saying that I'm anti-corruption, and then turns out like this. So I think in many of these countries, people's movements, the people themselves have tough questions for their leaders. The leaders really need to answer these questions in terms of how, after making all these claims, your own close associates have turned out, or you yourself have turned out to be a beneficiary of this. So I think the real question here is not whether it's legal or illegal, because that's what a lot of these people are going to be saying in the coming weeks and months, that this was technically legal. The question is that in terms of ethics, in terms of how the world is structured right now, in terms of the massive inequalities that we see around us, is this something that we should accept? So I think that's
how
the
these
key
legalities
question.
are allowed
Exactly.
to continue.
So I think that's a question that people like us need to take out of this.
Absolutely. And we're moving on to India from here, where the situation is quite tense in the state of Uttar Pradesh, the most populous state in the country, where protesting farmers, 4 of them, were mowed down actually by a car on Sunday in the village of Lakhimpur Kheri. The car was part of a convoy of a minister, Ajay Mishra, and apparently his son was in one of the vehicles. The death of these farmers has led to great anger, and further protests might have an impact on the larger farmers' movement as a whole. As we mentioned before on the show, it's a protest movement and agitation that's been going on against the 3 farm bills. It's been on for 10 months. Prashant, what's the latest on this story, which I'm sure you're covering quite closely?
Right. So Lakhimpur Kheri in Uttar Pradesh right now, actually, the whole state for that matter is in a very tense situation. It's a rapidly developing story. So what we do know is that on Sunday, like you mentioned, the farmers were mowed down. There is a video, its provenance hasn't completely been verified, which has brutal visuals of, say, these vehicles running onto the farmers. Newsclick reporters, for instance, who went to the ground, talked to some of these farmers, they bring out the, the almost dastardly nature of the act, the horrifying nature in which it happened, because these farmers were protesting very peacefully. They were protesting against the arrival of a senior BJP leader to the area, and then this convoy comes and just runs into these farmers. There are allegations that some of the people, including the minister's son, got out, was shooting in the air and was rescued by the police. Now, the minister's son, of course, has claimed that he was nowhere in the picture, but there are many eyewitnesses who say he was. A case has been registered against him. There was a huge amount of tension yesterday because the family said that they would not bury the bodies until the post-mortem reports came. Then the government is forced to announce a compensation for the families of the victims, but nonetheless the farmers are very determined, and the whole farmer community is very determined that justice has to be delivered in this case. And justice in this case would be to identify who were the people in that vehicle, what exactly did they do, and to ensure that they get the right amount of punishment. Because it so happens, especially in India, that if you're connected to the ruling party, if you're connected to the ruling elite, they'll register a case and then nothing ever happens. So there's a lot of disproportionate justice that we see in such situations. So that's the situation on the ground right now. The other important thing is that there's been a civil liberties crackdown to some extent. Leaders of the opposition have tried to go to that area to talk to the farmers, to express solidarity. Many of them have been detained. For instance, a key leader of the largest opposition party, the Indian National Congress, Priyanka Vadra, was arrested. The chief minister of another state, a neighboring state, tried to go there, and he's currently staging a sit-in at the airport because he's not been allowed to step out and go to that region. So that, and another former chief minister of the same state, again not allowed to go. So there's been a lot of, a bit of a crackdown situation as well. The government is claiming that it wants to avoid, further tensions, inflammations. But the fact really is that this is basically to ensure that this does not become more of an issue, and they sort of want to suppress it. That's what it looks like. So a big challenge for the government. Just to tell our viewers, the government in the state of Uttar Pradesh is run by the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is also in power in the center. The state is going to see elections in a few months. So for the ruling BJP, this could be a very dangerous development, in fact.
What's the larger impact, Prashant, on the farmers' movement?
Good question, because we've been talking about the farmers' movement on this show, on People's Dispatch before. Like you said, it's been 10 months. They have not got their demand, which is the withdrawal of these three controversial laws, and they have been escalating their movement in various ways, because they have been holding sit-ins in the capital, around the capital Delhi. They have been holding mass gatherings in various neighboring states, and now they also see the need to sort of take this one step further, combat the BJP electorally in this state, Uttar Pradesh, for instance, and other states as well. But an incident like this is bound to make the farmers much, much more angrier, because the insensitivity with which this happened. And we must remember that this is not a one-off incident, because earlier, there have been, in the past few weeks and months alone, there have been instances of senior leaders talking about, how to handle the farmers' protest. In fact, the leader of another state said that take up sticks. He was talking to the BJP cadre when talking about how to deal with the farmers' protests. So the farmers have been called anti-national, they've been called terrorists, they've been called all kinds of stuff. So I think there's probably a latent anger also among the farmers. This might lead to greater mobilizations. We have to see about this. For the BJP, it's a huge challenge, because they really haven't found a solution to the farmers' movement. They don't want to give concessions, like we talked about last time. But they don't want to appear weak, because this government...
They don't appear to back down.
Exactly. On the other hand, this government also knows that cracking down further might backfire, even considering that the elections are coming. So it's a bit of a challenge for the government in terms of how to handle this issue. I think for the farmers, this is probably a key moment in terms of how they decide to mobilize. There are claims that there are going to be more mass gatherings in the coming weeks as well. So whether that happens, whether this crystallizes, remains to be seen, the opposition to the BJP. In India, of course, a lot of factors work during the elections. Religion is a huge factor, caste is a huge factor, local patronage networks are a huge factor. All these elements playing, so the farmers' movement is also a key factor at this point. So how all these factors work together, how they influence the elections, people's votes, people's protests, is a huge question in the coming months.
Yeah.
What we can be assured of is that definitely this is going to be a few eventful few months before the elections in the state of Uttar Pradesh.
Yeah. And a really massive movement. So something we'll be keeping a close eye on definitely over the coming weeks and months. And from one horror show actually to the other, we're moving to the US, where the death toll from COVID-19 has gone past 700,000 on Friday, a number greater than the population of several cities in the United States. The last 100,000 deaths have occurred during a time when vaccines have been available to more than, to everyone in the US above the age of 12. It's a deeply frustrating fact, Prashant, for doctors, for public health workers, for anyone involved in essentially the social or healthcare network. What is going on in the US?
Good question, Siddhant, because the US, the richest country in the world, and I think I remember that some time ago, before the pandemic, there was a study about which countries are best equipped to handle a pandemic like this, and the US and the European countries were kind of on top of it. And COVID-19 struck, and then we realized it's not the case at all. But unfortunately, what has happened in the US right now, a lot of these recent deaths are being attributed to vaccine hesitancy. And that's really the most tragic, the most horrifying part of it, because there are regions in the United States where there's a huge amount of skepticism about the vaccines. It's ironic because in other parts of the world, people are literally dying for lack of it. But here, there is a huge amount of skepticism about vaccines. And this is believed to have been one of the factors that contributed to the rise in the death toll as well. Because like you said, the last 100,000 deaths take place at a time when vaccines are available to everyone concerned. I think the 600,000 number happened in June. So this is when the Delta variant has been raging through the United States. Some states like Georgia and Florida especially hit. And what we do see is basically that I think a number said that more than 70 to 80%, around 70 to 80% of the deaths could be attributed in various ways to either not taking the vaccine, people who did not take the vaccine, or people who caught the disease from those who did not take the vaccine. So that's a really, horrifying number again, so to speak. And what we see here basically is that despite all the attempts made by the authorities right now, there's still a substantial amount of resistance. And this resistance is maybe being strengthened by a massive campaign of disinformation as well about how vaccines are maybe dangerous in various ways. There are like innumerable rumors being churned out, and we should not even talk about them because they're just unbelievable, the kind of rumors that are being churned out right now. And some of these are like an industry almost. And we have to be honest, this also ties back to the Donald Trump administration. The fact that the Trump administration dealt with the pandemic in such a anti-scientific way, it lingers even now. So people who approach the pandemic that time in that way, I think that still lingers. So really the challenge for the US is to try to get as many people vaccinated as possible. There is progress in that. I mean, the numbers are good for the US as a country, but there are regions where the vaccination rates are bad. And apparently that is where the impact of the deaths is being seen the most. So very unfortunate and horrific number. I think the numbers for the US have increased are now more, the deaths are now more than the 1918 flu, which is considered one of the most catastrophic pandemics of all time. So really not a good reflection on the US, not a good reflection on the world that, in 2021, we are still in this situation.
Still dealing with public health emergencies. Where are we in that global sense, Prashant, in terms of dealing with the pandemic and COVID-19 in general?
Pretty bad, I would say, because again, like I said, what this shows is, what COVID-19 has shown us is how unequal a world we're living in, right? And if you look at the vaccination numbers, in Africa, I think the vaccination rate is around 6.5% or something of that sort. In the United States, we are close to, and Canada, we are close to 66% of people who received at least one dose. And this is an astonishing number because it shows the unbelievable amount of inequality that exists right now. And I think there was a statistic which said that nearly 78% of doses that have been administered so far have been administered in the high-income countries. So I think that shows us the level of inequality that has been, that is that is in its own way a pandemic.
Hmm.
And what we have seen the United Nations, we have seen the World Health Organization make calls for more vaccine equity, for more delivery of vaccines to countries through the COVAX initiative. There have been grand promises by the rich countries, but the translation into action has been very, very less. So what we have basically seen is we have seen a fractured global system. We've seen big corporates make huge amounts of money on it. We have seen that there has been a demand for patent waivers, which means that poor countries can produce vaccines more easily.
Right.
That has still not passed because of the resistance of some European countries. So we have seen every aspect, every possibility of inequality, every dimension of inequality that exists in the world being replicated, being played out in the COVID-19 scene.
Yeah.
And I think that's really the tragedy of the pandemic this time. It's not that the death, of course, is horrific. The numbers have crossed 4 million. But the real question, I think, that as a species, as a society, we need to ask really is how many of these could have been avoided? And I think the answer would be that a huge number could have been if we were in a more just world. If we were in a world, we're not talking about idealism of any sort here. Okay? We're just talking about global systems that work well, corporates that make money but not super high profits, governments that work with the bare minimum of sensitivity towards their neighbors, towards other countries in the world,
and the people that they represent.
Exactly. And I think in all these dimensions, in all these aspects, as a society, we have failed. So I think when we look back at COVID-19, maybe 5 or 10 years down the line, I hope these are the lessons that we learn as a society and try to see how we can improve, rather than when the next pandemic comes, we are in the same situation again.
Yeah. Grim, pretty grim. But there was a brief bit of respite, break from the global misinformation war when Facebook went out last evening. I was, of course, under a rock, so I had no idea this was going on. But beyond the jokes, Prashant, what actually happened, and how did this impact people?
Good question, because for Facebook, WhatsApp, and Instagram all sort of vanished for 6 hours almost. It was quite a strange thing to behold, because we've seen outages in the past, maybe an hour, half an hour.
Right.
But to think that this vast empire of services just vanishes for 6 hours is quite unimaginable. So what seems to have happened is that Facebook has its own internet, so to speak, and at some point its communication with the rest of the internet stopped. So for the rest of the world, Facebook stopped existing. That's, to put it in very basic terms, that's what seems to have happened. And they have finally had to manually reset it and all that. So a lot of stories around that. But I think a good question is really about, the question for us really is about how much of life is now centered around these services in terms of business, in terms of day-to-day communication. Interesting developments for young people in the West, for instance. Facebook no longer really is the point, and they don't bother about Facebook. Instagram is, but most people in the West, young people, have really left Facebook. They see it as something the old people do. So there were people expressing a sense of relief, etc., etc. But actually, in some ways, when you look at commerce, when you look at the sheer number of organizations, companies which depend on Facebook to run, offer such kind of communications, or WhatsApp for that matter, it really is a bit of a scary thought, because there's a possibility of many of these people seeing a complete standstill to their lives and their livelihoods, even for that short period of time. Facebook's share value sunk a bit. Mark Zuckerberg is believed to have lost $6 billion, whether he'll recover it quite soon, probably. The funniest comment I thought was somebody asking, there was an explainer in The Guardian, somebody said, was my data safe? And the response was, as much as when Facebook is functioning. So I think that's really the final word on this. Large questions about how they use our data, all that. But yeah, interesting.
That is right. Fair enough. But we are back. We are back online. We are on YouTube and Facebook and Instagram and any other social media that you choose, like my favorite picture in the background says. So follow, like, subscribe, and do all of those things. Write into us. Let us know what you think of the show and the topics that we cover, and things that are happening in your part of the world. This has been Daily Debrief for today. Thank you for watching. We'll see you again, same time, same place tomorrow.